107.8 FM.
Hello and welcome to Sundazed. Now, both this week and next week we're going to be having a look at Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. This is a fantastic novel, and as you perhaps know, it was Dickens' Day not so long ago. Some of the kids from Hetherset High have been looking at Great Expectations, and there are so many memorable and fascinating characters in this book, from Magwitch leaping out in the graveyard at the beginning to Miss Havisham and Pip himself, and it's a really intricate and interesting story. And the characters in it are very vivid, as are a lot of the characters in Dickens' novels. So I was having a chat a few weeks ago with some of the kids at Hetherset High who have been reading Great Expectations, and they've gotten to know quite a little bit about the life of Dickens himself, and have come to understand how his own life and the things that happened to him fed into some of his work, particularly in this case, the life of Pip as he goes from rags to riches throughout the course of the story. We're also going to have a reading. We're going to have the first chapter of Great Expectations this week from Ben Page, and then we have a couple of girls next week who are going to read out the chapter with Miss Havisham in her incredibly atmospheric, crusty, dusty house that she lives in, sealed up for 12 years against the rest of the world. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about Dickens himself and hear something about his life, and then hear something about perhaps one of his best known works, Great Expectations. So you all were new to Dickens, were you, when you started studying?
Yeah. Well, I've seen the film, Oliver Twist film.
Yeah.
Oh, you've seen Oliver Twist. Was that a recent version of Oliver Twist?
Yeah, there was one on TV like last year.
Yeah.
And the musical film of it.
Right, okay.
I've seen Christmas Carol.
Yeah, I saw Great Expectations at Christmas.
Was that Miss
That was
the woman who used to be in the X-Files?
Gillian Anderson.
Yes.
Was she little?
Is she little?
She
Don't know.
played Miss Havisham.
Yes.
A bit hard to tell how big people are on TV. She was good. So I gather, I didn't see it, but she got a good write-up.
No, she was good. I read in the magazine that there were some complaints that she didn't look old enough, but I thought that she was really she acted well, being quite old and sort of a wreck. She did that well.
How old, does anybody know how old she is actually supposed to be, Miss Havisham?
Wasn't it 12 years since her marriage?
Yeah.
So is she...
And they get married.
And then she adopts
in their 20s.
Estelle when she's a baby, and
Yeah.
was it Estella?
Stella.
Sorry.
Right.
And she's about 14 now.
So, I mean, in that 12 years, it's never struck me that she herself was particularly old, but what she is just incredibly faded
Yeah.
and
White
disappointed.
Yes.
And the worst thing is she's never really gotten over what's happened to her, and then seems to spend all of her time plotting and scheming.
It's because she's shut out of the world and she has no sense of time, so she's aged differently to how people normally would.
That's very interesting, having no sense of time.
Yeah.
I wonder what that's like. I mean, it must just be like floating in a vacuum all the time.
She just creates her own world.
Really
So-
weird.
Lives in her head.
Yeah.
Yeah, not a nice place to be. Full of cobwebs,
Yeah.
by the look of it.
So's her house.
Yes, very cobwebby. Very cobwebby. Not good if you don't like spiders. But yeah, a very kind of dried up person. What have you all read the same books, or have you all read different things? We see here a lot of mentions of Great Expectations. Have you all?
Yeah, we're all reading that.
Class
in
thing.
English.
I
think I read Oliver Twist a few years ago, and I read some of A Christmas Carol, but that was in my own time, so that wasn't relevant to the lessons or anything.
Did you find there was much difference between reading it in a classroom situation when people are there to talk to you about some of the background perhaps of the author, and reading it at home?
I personally prefer reading at home because when I'm not like the kind of person who likes to start reading something and then stop every other page to discuss it. I like to read it and then read the whole thing and then sort of go over it in my head afterwards.
Yeah.
So I prefer reading at home, but I do agree that there is something to reading in lessons that there's other people who can offer their opinions, so it's sort of I can think about it in different ways because of how other people have thought about it.
Yeah, so it helps to widen out the discussion, but like you say, it's kind of an artificial setting in a way, isn't it? And I think what you probably need to do is then go back again when you've had a look at something, go back again and see what you make of it for yourself. If you know something about the author and you know something about their circumstances and the life that they've had, you can see how that feeds into what they're writing about. Can you tell me one critical thing, probably about Dickens, that perhaps in social terms was a big part of his writing?
Yeah, the way class change.
Yes.
His books have got big.
Yes. And I think his own life circumstances and incredible fame. I mean, for those days, and it was international fame. He regularly went, well, I don't know if he regularly went to America, but he certainly went on a couple of occasions, I think, and did, sort of mammoth book tours. And he was living in an age which, certainly compared to now, was an age that was pretty much obsessed by class and by social climbing as well, and trying to work your way out of the gutter. As Oscar Wilde said, I may be in the gutter, but I'm looking at the stars, something like that.
It's like what middle school was like. If you're not popular, then you don't get as much advantages.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
That's
And
how
he's
you
not
relate
trying
to
to
it.
deny that, is he? In no way, shape or form is he trying to hide from that and say that people aren't what they are. He goes in for the kill and does quite a number on society and sort of says, this is how it is. It's a dog-eat-dog world.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
How sympathetic is he, do you think, to the underdog, if you like, want of better?
I think in Great Expectations he's quite sort of kind to the lower classes.
Yes.
Because at the beginning of the book you feel very sorry for Pip, and you like him as a character.
Yeah.
And then as he goes up in class and becomes more of a gentleman, he becomes more snobbish and cruel, and you prefer him as a lower class.
I mean, in any age, there are always problems. There are always people who are losing out. There are always people who aren't getting enough of a shout or a fair chance in life. But certainly, I mean, in this country at least, it isn't generally a toss-up between you've got no money and you starve. It isn't, I mean, people generally get enough to eat. But of course, in those days, there's no welfare state. If you're down on your luck and if the creditors were chasing you, if you were in debt and that kind of thing, then you really were in stuck, and it could make the difference, I suppose, between a life with your family or going into the workhouse and all being separated and that kind of thing. So it's like there's a big shadow hanging over people all the time.
It was more dangerous, I think. Like these days, if you get a bit poor, you tend to be helped, whereas in those days, you tend to be sort of just cleared.
Well, if if you had to pay for the doctor, if you've got 17 children and 6 of them are ill and you've got to pay for the doctor, then how do you do it? There's no money if it's that, or eat supper that night. What do you do? Do you know anything about the life of Dickens?
No, about his dad and about how he went to jail.
Yes.
The debtor jail. So.
Yes. Do you think that cast a shadow over his life? Do you think that haunted him in some way?
I think that made him want to be richer and get away from that sort of life.
Yes.
So seeing his dad in a debtor's prison had maybe shocked him into wanting to better himself and do better in life.
Quite possibly. And I suppose it's also the fact that he sees the way things are run and he thinks, well, I've never understood how you're supposed to work yourself out of debt in a debtor's prison. I don't know. Do you know anything about them? Was there some way of...
I think you just got given a chance now and then to do something to get away.
I don't know, maybe you were reliant on people outside actually getting you out of...
It's like a bail or something that they had to pay a certain fine to get you out of it.
I think that's a bit more how it worked.
With the workhouse thing, I think they got people coming in and then taking people away. So they couldn't get away from the workhouse. They were in there until someone came in and took them out.
Yeah. So I guess the sort of family connections were even more important. Well, not even more important. It depends on how you view it. But certainly, I think in financial terms, you needed your family around you. You needed somebody there to bail you out, or you needed a benefactor, some description.
I think he's basing almost sort of repeating and telling Hip the life which he had through Pip's eyes, because Pip went from nothing to something, and he might be trying to project his life onto that.
Yes, absolutely.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
So it's Great Expectations that you've all been reading in class.
Yes.
Do you think you could give me, between you, a sort of précis of the story of what happens? Who's the main character?
Pip.
Pip. and he's a sympathetic character, is he? Do you know what I mean by sympathetic character? Yeah.
He's an orphan who lost his parents at a young age, so he never actually knew what they looked like. And when we're introduced to him at the start of the story, he's living with his sister, who is quite strict and who often beats him, and her husband, Joe Gargery, who was the local blacksmith, who is quite nice to Pip.
I was going to say Joe's quite nice, isn't he? Yeah.
It does say in the book that Pip considers him to be more of his equal and to be quite a child because of how much he can relate to Joe.
Right, okay. Now, is Great Expectations the one where there's a creepy guy in the graveyard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Tell me about the creepy guy in the graveyard. What's that all?
He was getting Pip to steal food from the house and then take it to him.
Oh, right.
He was a convict and he'd broken out of prison. And he happened to stumble across Pip in a graveyard, so he threatened Pip. And so Pip brought him food, but he was later in the book captured and sent back to jail.
Is he a bad guy all the way through?
We only really see sort of frightening parts of it, and when you get scared you think of them as like bad or evil, but I think that he's sort of a loose thread and he'll come back into it later.
I can't remember how he does come back into it later, and if you haven't read it all...
I've seen it.
If you've seen it, right, okay, then it's probably best... For the listeners out there, we won't say what happens at the end of the book in case anybody's not read it. Why is Pip in the graveyard in the first place? Is he in there?
To visit his parents' graves.
Right.
So that
he's an orphan.
creates sympathy for him as well. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a vulnerable moment, and then this unpleasant personage leaps out from behind a tombstone. And do you have a picture in your minds of what Pip looks like?
Yeah.
The one from the film.
If we're watching the film as well,
Yeah.
it's the film, and it's sort of
They
the way you would think he'd be portrayed, the way he's in the film.
Right.
He's sort of like
Quite mousy.
quite
Yeah.
small, quite very vulnerable. You can see the vulnerability in him.
Yeah.
And he was at the programme which was on at Christmas, he was a very similar actor, acted it very similarly, and it showed that they portrayed the character very well.
Okay. So he looked the way you thought he ought to look? Because if you're reading about a character, you have a sort of picture of them in your head. I think Dickens goes into a lot of physical description, doesn't he, about what somebody's like?
Because he doesn't drag, he just sort of flows it in quite fluently.
Does he sort of literally describe the way people look, or does he give you a sense of what their character is through their physical mannerisms or the way they dress?
Definitely the latter.
You think more of that?
Yeah.
Do you think that's better than saying, he was so tall and he had green eyes and
Yeah.
Because you can make your own image of them then, and it's not just exactly how the writer would think.
Yeah.
So it's different people's imaginations.
It's very clever to be able to do that, isn't it? To leave you the room and the freedom to summon up the character in your own head, but just to give you that sort of framework, lets you know something about how they speak and how they talk. And
it's good how he does that through it. Like when you're reading a book and you're coming up for like the big paragraph just going on about their appearance, it can be quite tedious, and it's quite nice just to see it from their mannerisms, so it's quite fluent. It's not just he was tall.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
is there a point in the book where you lose sympathy for Pip at any point?
Yeah.
When he starts to get rich, he starts to. But because he has a moment where he meets Joe again.
Right.
And he's rich and Joe's poor. So, and you can sort of see there's less sympathy for Pip then, because the way he acts. I don't think he intentionally means to act that way.
Yeah.
It just makes it really awkward, and the sympathy sort of gets lost.
Yeah.
And he starts being all snobby. He doesn't
Okay.
mean to, but.
What's Dickens addressing, do you think? Is there something about that very tight class divide that once Pip has got money, it's then very difficult for him to interact comfortably with the people he's known and the people he's grown
I think it
grown up
could
with?
associate to Dickens' own life. If he had
Right,
faced
yes,
problems when he had passed between classes, because in that days it was a very strict divide between them,
Yes.
and not many people did pass between classes.
Yeah.
So people that he had known before would become intimidated by him
Yeah.
because of his wealth.
What's probably the most significant class, do you think, in the Victorian age? What's really emerged? What class has really emerged by the time the Victorians are in full Victorian swing? Lower, upper? middle?
Well, there's a lot of lower class people that are around because lower class families tend to not have very much that they can have, so they tend to have more children to grow their family.
Yes.
Whereas upper class families will just almost sit on their wealth and
just keep going and try and keep up. I think that a few hundred years ago you would have had starting to emerge a class that was called the middling sort. And these were farmers who, might have become quite wealthy, or the yeomanry who've got a bit of land and have done quite well for themselves. But by the time the Victorians are there, the middle classes are very well established and they're very interested in, I guess, and you could have wealthy, very wealthy middle classes who have a lot of money and very interested in philanthropy. Do you know what philanthropy is? I guess it's kind of social concerns. If you're a wealthy philanthropist, you might put your money into some kind of social reform or making aspects of society better, that kind of thing. Really what it means is you've got the money to interfere. And I suppose in some ways this is perhaps... Dickens, I don't think he was born into a working class household particularly, but he was born into a family who were struggling for money, and so as you say, his dad ends up in debtor's prison. But he made that journey, didn't he? He covered that distance. Do you know what some of his interests were as a man, as an individual?
Writing.
Yes, but interesting enough, what he was also very interested in was acting. I think
he did recitals of his own books in front of millions of people and sort of one-man shows.
This is it, and I think that was by all accounts, that was one of the things that contributed to a perhaps slightly earlier than usual demise, because he worked so hard and he was giving it all that and acting out all these characters. It must have taken a lot of energy to do that, and to travel all that way. And you're not talking about hopping on an airplane and a few hours later you're there and you're a bit jet lagged, but you'll be all right. That's a long old passage to America and a lot of travelling around. But I think, and I heard recently that he was always very sad when he got to the end of the book, because he was so immersed in it, he was so engrossed in his characters and in their lives, and he never wanted to leave them behind, and he was only really content when he'd started knitting together the next set of characters and the next tale.
I think that's the making of a good writer, because if you can really relate to the book, then so can the reader, and they can tell that it hasn't been quite shallowly done.
Yes. If you don't care about your characters, if you don't invest in them very, very heavily and make them absolutely and utterly real to yourself, you are simply never going to take your reader with you. You'll always leave them out in the cold in some way. And he manages that in spades.
Sundazed on Future Radio 107.8 FM.
Okay, this is Ben Page, and Ben is going to read the first chapter of Great Expectations for us.
My father's family name being Pirrip, and my Christian name, Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. I give Pirrip as my father's family name, on the authority of his tombstone, and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. From the character and turn of the inscription, also Georgiana, wife of the above, I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. To 5 little stone lozenges, each about 1.5 feet long, which were arranged in a neat row beside their grave, and were sacred to the memory of 5 little brothers of mine, who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in that universal struggle. I am indebted for a belief I religiously entertained that they had all been born on their backs, with their hands in their trouser pockets, and never take them out in this state of existence. Within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, later of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dykes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, and was the marshes, and that the low leading line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers, growing afraid of it all, and beginning to cry, was Pip. "Hold your noise!" cried a terrible voice, as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat!" A fearful man, all in coarse grey, a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied round his head, a man who had been soaked in water, and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped, and shivered, and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray, don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick." "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, staring at me. "Give it mouth." Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Pint out the place." I pointed to where our village lay, on the flat inshore, among alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made me go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling, while he ate the bread ravenously. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips, "what fat cheeks you have got." I believe they were fat, though I was at the time undersized, for my years, and not strong. "Darn me if I couldn't eat 'em," said the man, with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I hadn't half a mind to do it." I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, partly to keep myself from crying. "Now looky here," said the man. "Where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped, and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgiana, that's my mother." "Oh," said he, coming back, "and is that your father, or longer your mother?" "Yes, sir," said I. "Him too, late of this parish." "Ha!" he muttered then, considering. "Who do you live with, supposing you're kindly to let live, which I hadn't made up my mind about?" "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" said he, and he looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and at me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down on mine, and mine looked most helplessly up to his. "Now looky here," he said, "the question being whether you're not to be let to live. You know what a file is?" "Yes, sir." "And do you know what whittles is?" "Yes, sir." After each question, he tilted me over a little more, so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger. "You get me a file." He tilted me again. "And you get me whittles." He tilted me again. "You bring 'em both to me." He tilted me again. "Or I'll have your heart and liver out." He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened, and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, "If you would kindly please to help to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." He gave me the most tremendous dip and roll, so that the church jumped over its own weathercock. Then he held me by the arms in an upright position on the top of the stone, and went on in these fearful terms. "You bring me, tomorrow morning early, that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me, and that old battery over yonder. Do it, and you never dare to say a word, or dare to make a sign, concerning you having ever seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go from my words, in any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted, and ate. Now, I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man hid with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man has a secret way, peculiar to himself, of getting at a boy, and at his heart, and at his liver. It is vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, may be warm in bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe. But that young man will softly creep and creep his way to him and tear him open. I am keeping that young man from harming of you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold that young man off your inside. Now, what do you say? I said that I would get him the file, and I would get him what broken bits of food I could, and I would come to him at the battery early in the morning. Say, Lord, strike you dead if you don't, said the man. I said so, and he took me down. Now, he pursued, you remember what you've undertook, and you remember that young man, and you get home. Good night, sir, I faltered. Much of that, said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. I wish it was a frog, or an eel. At the same time, he hugged his shuddering body in both his arms, clasping himself as if to hold himself together, and limped towards the low church wall. As I saw him go, picking his way among the nettles and among the brambles that bound the green mounds, he looked in my young eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people, stretching up cautiously out of their graves to get a twist upon his ankle and pull him in. When he came to the low church wall, he got over it like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then he turned round to look for me. When I saw him turning, I set my face towards home and made the best use of my legs. But presently I looked over my shoulder and saw him going on again towards the river, still hugging himself in both arms and picking his way with his sore feet among the great stones dropped onto the marshes here and there for stepping places where the rains were heavy or the tide was in. The marshes were just a long, black, horizontal line then, as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad, nor yet so black, and the sky was just a row of long, angry red lines, and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river, I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered, like an unhooped cask upon a pole, an ugly thing when you were near it. The other a gibbet, with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on towards this latter, as if he were the pirate come to life, and come down, and going back to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and, as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too. I looked around for the horrible young man, and could see no signs of him, but now I was frightened again, and ran home without stopping.
There we are. If you haven't already read Great Expectations, we hope that this might tempt you to have a look. Don't forget to tune in next week. We'll be hearing from two students who are going to be reading out between them a chapter with Miss Havisham when she first interviews Pip when he first goes to her house and is somewhat humiliated by Estella. But until next week, that's all, folks.